Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. Hello, my dear watchers. It is I, the shadow. Now, for those of you who don't know who the shadow is, allow me to shed some light for you folks. As you can see, the shadow was a most famous detective way back in the 30s and 40s, way before comic books was made. And of course, he didn't appear in the comic books. He appeared in something that was really popular back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And it was Pulp Fiction. And no, I'm not talking about Pulp Fiction, that Quentin Tarantino movie he made. Get your head out of your butt. It's Pulp Fiction magazines. They were very popular back in the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. And what the Pulp Fiction magazines are, they're more like these. Reader's Digest-sized magazines full of short stories. Of course, I have a Alfred Hitchcock mystery magazine. And of course, a Larry Queen mystery magazines. They're still around. But of course, back then, one thing about these Pulp Fiction magazines here is that they were so popular. They were filled with short stories. And there were tons of stories in Pulp Fiction time. I mean, there was science fiction, there was fantasy, but most of all, horror, murder, mystery, ladies and gentlemen. They're the most famous ones of them all. So therefore, one author decided to write a story about a man who can cloud people's minds so he can be invisible. At first, he starts out as a bad guy, and then they decided to change him and make him become a crime-fighting hero. This here is a reprint of some of their Shadow magazines. Hardly any. There's only a few pictures here, as you can see, but it's all reprint of the magazine. Written by Walter B. Gibson. And the Shadow got so popular in the Pulp Fiction magazines that they decided, it was way before television was invented, that they decided to have them on radio shows. As you can see, I have one cassette tape of one of the Shadow's adventures. But I have a CD of all the great adventures of the Shadow. And Orson Welles, he himself did the voice of the Shadow. So, while awaiting the time, they decided to put him in movies now. Now, these movies are not exactly from the book. They made this one. That's the name of this movie. Except he's just called Lamont Cranston, the wealthy young man of our town, who works on the radio station called the Shadow Network. And that is the Shadow's alter ego. Although he goes by another alter ego, but I always keep on forgetting his name. But he always goes by Lamont Cranston, wealthy young man of our town, and always have Margot Lane, his aide and companion, who knows who the Shadow really is. She helps him out any time if he's in trouble. And then they made this movie, The Shadow Strikes. Again, he's not the Shadow, he's just Lamont Cranston in disguise. But since when comic books was getting famous, they decided to put him in comic books. Oh yeah, I also forgot. They did put the Shadow on a TV serial right here. The Shadow TV serial. Since they made one with Batman, they decided to make one with the Shadow involved. Now, I would have a reprint of the original comic book, what it really looked like, but sadly, the printer was running out of ink. But the ownership, the company who owned the Shadows, have been shifting to one company to the next. One time they made the Shadow in the DC comics. And then they made another Shadow from the Dark Horse comics. But recently, now they put the Shadow in the present and make this comic book series that I have one issue of, The Shadow Now, where he's no longer living in the 30s, now he's living in the present time as the new Shadow. And way back in 1994, they decided, now, back in the 50s, they decided to make the Shadow TV series, but sadly there was only an unaired pilot. And sadly that pilot never catched on. Ingrates. But in 1994, they decided to make the Shadow movie. The Shadow, starring Alec Baldwin as a Shadow, where he's battling against an evil man who goes by the name of Shiwan Khan, last descendant of Genghis Khan, who has the same powers and ability like the Shadow. Which I have to say, the movie was very good. It's just too bad it's not as memorable as Batman. And believe it or not, Sam Raimi, he himself is a Shadows fan, and he was planning to make the Shadows movie, but sadly somebody beat him to it. So he made this movie as like a sort of a Shadow movie, but his own version, called Darkman, starring Liam Neeson. Now, it's not about Lamont Cranston or the Shadow himself. It's about a scientist who gets burned up by a bunch of mobsters who burned up his lab and caught him on fire. And he ended up in the hospital with helpful surgery to fix his scars. So now his nervous system, he's immune to physical pain, but it increases his emotional pain. And he was a scientist on prosthetic skin for burnt victims that he decided to wear a mask and start practicing on impressions. So therefore, he wears a mask of disguise himself as somebody, but he always goes on as Darkman. I only have the first movie. I wasn't interested on seeing the sequel or the third movie. But I did see the on-air pilot, but sadly that one didn't catch on either. I guess the Shadow will go on, from comic books to movies. And did you know that Sam Raimi was planning to make a new Shadow movie, but instead, it was canceled. One of these days, I like to go to Sam Raimi and help him out, so he'll finally make the TV series of The Shadow. And they did one crossover comic book back in the 80s when the Shadow turns out to be a descendant of the legendary Dark Knight himself. None other than
Batman. That's right. When DC owned the rights of the Shadow comics, they decided to do a crossover comic where the Shadow meets Batman and hinted that Batman might be a descendant to the Shadow because they both got a lot in common. They both are wealthy millionaires with secret identities and wants to fight crime. That is true. Batman was one of the inspiration. The Shadow was the inspiration for Batman, along with that other Pulp Fiction character called the Black Bat. But I'll get to the Black Bat later. But right now, I think it's time we should focus more on
the Shadow. And of course, the Shadow has crossover with other Pulp Fiction heroes, like the Green Hornet, and of course the Spider. He's a vigilante who wears a hat and has a mask decorated with webs. And also, the next descendant of Zorro, and I formed a team called The Mask. And I also cross over with other superheroes. And then I cross over with another kind of comic book, unlike any other before. They did a comic book where I entered the Twilight Zone. But I guess the Shadow never dies. But I guess that's the point about being the Shadow. Nobody knows if I'm real or not. Because that's my power. I cloud people's minds. I can read their thoughts to know who they are and what bad things they've done, what sins they committed, and act like a guilty conscience to them. 'Cause the weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows. So if you like this review, please leave a comment down below, hit like, and subscribe. As for me, and if you see this video on Facebook, don't forget to share it. Now I heard Mr. Multi-Voice Reviewer, he decided to review a science fiction franchise, which I mentioned before. Multi-Voice Reviewer is going to review The Twilight Zone. As for me, I'm gonna cloud your mind so I can be invisible. And remember, don't do anything bad or sinful, 'cause the Shadow knows.